Behold the dawn of Energy X. Who could have foretold the perils it would bring? Who could have foreseen the heroes it would inspire?
What if I were to steal the Energy X? I could travel to Earth and find worthy men and women to endow with its power. They could stand up to the monstrosities Lord Dominion intends to create.
The intersection of comic book fans and video game fans is very substantial. And that makes it all the more confusing why there haven't been more titles like Freedom Force versus the Third Reich. The new game doesn't really break any new ground or cover any ground that the first title didn't cover, but there have been so few imitators in the 3 years since the first title was released that it really doesn't matter. This game is basically the same as the original Freedom Force, but that means it's a great game. For those of you who don't know, the Freedom Force is a big team of superheroes, and you're going to lead them through a wide variety of missions here. You'll only be able to take 4 heroes on each mission, so you'll have to kind of tailor the powers of the hero to the mission ahead of you. And these missions can involve a wide variety of things. They can involve fighting dinosaurs in crowded city streets, or beating up Nazi henchmen in underground lairs. Basically, just the regular comic book conventions here. Now, I don't want to ruin the story progression. There are a lot of twists, there are a lot of turns, a lot of surprises, particularly so for those who played the first game and have a frame of reference for some of these characters. I will say, and I guess it's no surprise given the title, that the Freedom Force does go back in time in this game to the Second World War. And that means you're not only getting the great 60s era comic book experience, but you're also getting the great wartime era comic book experience. And both are handled really well here. They're both full of the cliches and conventions that you would expect from those eras. And it really goes to show that Irrational hit the tone just right with this, as they did with the first game. You know, it's a slightly satiric, yet still very, very loving and very faithful homage to the conventions of the comic books of those times. Now, the game starts with a brief tutorial, but after that, all bets are off. It really takes off like gangbusters. The very first mission is a real showstopper as far as I'm concerned, and it really sets the tone for the game very nicely. And you won't have any trouble getting up to speed if you haven't played the first game, but it's great that the story starts off with a bang, rather than sort of eases into more catastrophic circumstances that you would expect to be dealing with later. You'll get a lot of cool new characters this time around, too. Some from the 60s era and some from the Second World War. And they've got cool new powers that supplement those of the existing members of Freedom Force. And they've got really awesome comic book origins, like we saw in the original game. You can also create your own characters with the character creation tool. It's the same tool that you saw before in the previous game, but you're going to get a lot more prestige points this time around, so you can recruit your own heroes a lot more quickly. There are a lot of great new villains as well. Some old standbys are here, but the new war-era villains are great. You've got a fat opera singer. You've got this fire elemental controlling sword master from Japan. And then you've got this sort of high-headed mentalist working for the Nazis. It's really great. The interface is still the same, too. You select the default power for your hero to use, which you can activate by left-clicking, or you can right-click to pause the game and open up a drop-down menu of all their powers. And it's a really convenient interface. Worked just great the first time around and works equally well here. The big change is in the area of graphics. The character models still look pretty much the same as usual, but the world around them and the effects are much, much better. And that goes a long way towards making Freedom Force versus the Third Reich seem like a living world. It's still got that 4-color comic book presentation, but the textures have a lot more depth now. The shadows and lighting are greater. There are some very cool particle effects for some of the powers. So when you see somebody throw a bolt of fire, it looks a lot more convincing this time around. I'd still like to see a slightly better camera, be able to get very, very close in on the action and get that ground level perspective that I crave. But the camera's pretty convenient otherwise. It does give you a very good view of the action in general. The voices are an inch away from becoming silly, but they really capture the tone of the game, and they go a long way towards preserving that sort of tongue-in-cheek humor that I was talking about earlier. There's a lot more going on in terms of multiplayer this time around. There are plenty of new modes, and though some of them can get chaotic, they include your opponent's character portraits on the bottom of the screen, so you can use those to target your enemies. Makes it a lot easier to fight, particularly so since you can't pause the game. There are no surprises in this game apart from the cool new story and the improved graphics, but there really don't need to be. Like I said, the original Freedom Force was a fantastic game, so we're more than happy to dive in for more with Freedom Force versus the Third Reich. If you love comic book heroes or if you love squad-based strategy games, this one is a definite must-have.
Now, see here, Bullet. How do you know so much about my jetpack?
I read about it when I was a kid in one of your comic books. In fact, in the May 1954 issue.
When you were a kid? Why, you're older than I am.
Right, mate. I see you haven't sussed out the whole bullet is from the future thing yet.
Perhaps we can save the metaphysical discussion for another time. Or have you forgotten? We've a war to win.